Okay, so welcome everyone for this Wordsworth inspired theme today. And thank you for coming if you're on campus or if you're guests from off campus. I hope you're going to enjoy the event. Just to establish the protocols of the speakers for today. So I think we're going to listen to both speakers sort of one after the other, with Sarah going first and then Polly. And obviously what we hope is that we have a dialogue today. I'm sure we will, and a kind of conversation. And so you can be sort of thinking about your questions and of course post them in the chat. If you need to write it down urgently as it occurs to you, that's fine. But also, you know, sort of thinking about how to link, I guess, the two pieces that we're going to hear, which will be good. And we'll catch up with those questions at the end, and I can help Polly and Sarah with that if they need to. And yeah, so we'll just listen to both of them and then have a kind of question session at the end, if that's okay. So formal welcome to Polly and Sarah. We're very fortunate today to bring together two creative writers who also both have a shared interest in Dorothy Wordsworth and a long-standing relationship to the department, which is a great pleasure. So I'll just introduce Polly quickly first. So Polly Atkin did her collaborative PhD with Lancaster and the Wordsworth Trust way back, Polly, in 2007 to 10. I looked it up, I was like, oh, that did disturb me slightly, I must admit. And very well she did on that too. And Polly is one of those unusual people who genuinely does manage to straddle the critical creative divide. And she has various academic papers and publications, but also two recent collections of poetry and a work of non-fiction about Dorothy that she's going to be reading from today that's just come out, I'm guessing, called Recovering Dorothy, The Hidden Life of Dorothy Wordsworth. So very exciting to hear that. And Sarah has taught for us, letting her dog out or in. I'll wait for you to return, Sarah. Oh, yes. So yes, Sarah's for us on the creative writing distance learning MA for many years. I couldn't even find how long that was, Sarah, but a long time, I know, and done a great service to the department through that. She has 5 published collections of poetry, and she's also very sort of experimental and likes working collaboratively with artists and filmmakers. And I think your work on the Grasmere journals came out of one of those projects as well, didn't it, Sarah? That's going to inform your reading today. So she's going to be reading from a larger collection, A Perfect Mirror, but the section relating to Dorothy. So as I said, we'll let the two readings kind of speak to each other and then ask questions at the end. So I will mute myself, and maybe if Polly and Sarah, maybe just make sure your thing's not on so you don't just, you know, affect each other's sound. That'll be great. And I will see you again shortly.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, I have a very demanding border collie. Hopefully he's going to settle down now and not interrupt us too much. Now, there's a great deal of technological anxiety going on here as I hopefully share my slides with you. It was there a minute ago, and then it's...
If there's a problem, let me know.
Yeah, it's just disappeared. I'm just having to put it again. And there is, yeah, Josephine, there is a text of my talk that I've sent to John. John, can you put that in the chat?
Certainly.
Yep. So the slides are some of the...
Just to interrupt, Sarah, I think there is a CC button along the bottom, I think, as well. So I think you should be able to get captions in Teams. Is that right?
Yes, it is there somewhere, definitely.
On my screen, Josephine, it's along the bottom on the left-hand side, confusingly, the opposite of Zoom. So that might help, but I don't know, John, whether you need to.
I think if you go, Josephine, if you can see like 3 little dots, like a parenthesis sign, there's a little menu there. And if you go to live captions, where it says CC, is probably saying, you can turn live captions on. But John will put the attachment up as well. So either way, hopefully that will work.
Fab, thank you.
Okay. So, Dissolving Hearts, The Colour of Rain, How Contemporary Women Poets Are Recovering Dorothy Wordsworth. My first encounter with Dorothy Wordsworth was as an undergraduate studying romantic poetry. It wasn't... Sorry. Somebody's saying they can't hear me now.
It's okay, Sarah, you carry on. I'll put the instructions for Josephine into the chat. So
okay. Yeah, it's quite confusing and there are lots of things popping up. Okay, I'll start again. My first encounter with Dorothy Wordsworth was as an undergraduate studying romantic poetry. It wasn't an encounter with a real person, but with a shadow, an indistinct figure scuttling along after her famous brother as he strode the hills writing his famous poems. Were we told of her journals? I can't remember. We certainly did not read them. All I recall was that Dorothy copied down William's thoughts as he walked and composed. She was of no more consequence than that. She had no voice or agency beyond this act. The image of the mighty male poet constructing his mighty poems alone and lonely as a cloud remained unchallenged. This was 30 years ago, I have to say, and I am a huge fan of Wordsworth's poetry. It would be many years before I'd encounter Dorothy Wordsworth again, this time at the Dorothy Wordsworth Women's Poetry Festival held in Grasmere in 2014, set up by the then Poet Laureate Carol Ann Duffy. I was there as part of an exhibition of women's landscape poetry, Where We Begin to Look, curated by Darren Rhys-Jones, and shown alongside paintings and drawings by the contemporary visual artist Zoe Benbow. I'm just going to show you one of Zoe's pictures this is a painting of Grasmere. You can look at that. Zoe paints large-scale abstracts of the landscape, and her practice emerges from walking, drawing, daydreaming, and immersing herself in the landscape. It was at the festival that I heard Duffy's poem, Dorothy Wordsworth is Dead, and more strikingly, Sinead Morrissey's poem with that image of Dorothy's from the Grasmere journals of lake water under moonlight shimmering like mackerel. This was a poet's image, and it's unsurprising that Morrissey steals it for her poem. It was this line that led me to Dorothy's writings in the Grasmere journals. In 2017, Zoe and I came together to work on a project for the Wordsworth Trust, and there was no doubt in our minds that it would be Dorothy's writings, not William's, that we would respond to. The first thing that strikes you on reading the Grasmere journals is their simplicity. The second thing that strikes you is their complexity. Woven into the daily accounts of walking, fetching the mail, gardening, reading, sitting by the lake or on the hillside, writing and working with William on his poems, encounters with local characters, visits by Dorothy and William's many friends and loved ones, headaches and heartaches, are finally observed details of the natural world. Phrases and motifs are repeated, extended, circled back to and recorded again and again in a masterclass of noticing that elevates the everyday, the overlooked and unobserved, and makes of the rain, the clouds, the trees, the colours of the sky, of leaves and flowers as they emerge and bloom and fade, a closely observed tapestry of wonder written in such clear, immediate prose that it's as if she has just spoken the words in your ear. It's not surprising that modern and contemporary poets have found poetry in Dorothy's prose. Here's an extract from the Grasmere Journal. This is January the 26th, which was a Tuesday in 1802. A dull morning. I have employed myself in writing this journal and reading newspapers till now, 10:30. We are going to walk, and I am ready and waiting by the kitchen fire for William. We set forward intending to go into Easdale, but the wind being rather loudish and blowing down Easdale, we turned up under Silver Howe for a sheltered walk. We went a little beyond the Wyke, then up to John's Grove, where the storm of Thursday has made sad ravages. 2 of the finest trees are uprooted, one lying with the turf about its root, as if the whole together had been pared by a knife. The other is a larch. Several others are blown aside. One is snapped in 2. We gathered together a faggot. William had tired himself with working. He resolved to do better. We received a letter from Mary by Fletcher with an account of C's arrival in London, that would be Coleridge. I wrote to Mary before bedtime. We sat till we were both tired, for William wrote out part of his poem and endeavoured to alter it, and so made himself ill. I copied out the rest for him. We went to bed late. William wrote to Annette. So you see there these sort of layers of many things that are happening throughout the day, from the very sort of quotidian, waiting by the kitchen fire, reading the newspapers, to the weather, to these sort of beautiful observations of the trees, like sad ravages, and that again, very much a poet's image of everything being pared by a knife, to the evening activities of working on together on William's poems. Just re-find my text. Dorothy did write poems, and increasingly so in later life, even arranging her work to be published as a collection. And the journals were written to be read out loud, to William, to Coleridge, and their wider literary and family circle. But Dorothy, on the whole, did not see herself as a writer, as we might think of her today. This is something Polly Atkin explores in detail in her new book, Recovering Dorothy, The Hidden Life of Dorothy Wordsworth, which is the first comprehensive exploration of Dorothy's physical and creative life beyond the Grasmere journals. It is also important to remember that Dorothy was not only a collaborator in the genesis of William's poems, but his editor. She wrote out drafts of his poems and discussed their development in detail, as we see in the extract above. No wonder he wrote such lasting poetry, with his greatest source of influence and editorship on hand, daily. Can you imagine, as a writer, having that continual support and feedback? I think it's extraordinary. One writer with whom we might draw parallels with Dorothy is the poet John Clare, and in my collection you'll see there is also a series of poems to John Clare. And John Clare was a poet I was very much thinking about around about the same time I was thinking about Dorothy. Clare, born in 1793, was only a child when the Wordsworths arrived in Grasmere, but we do know that he read Wordsworth's poetry later on. Clare's poetry received brief celebrity in his lifetime, and his work is only more recently being given its proper place in the canon and as our foremost nature poet. Like Dorothy's writings in her journal, Clare's nature poetry celebrates the natural world from ground level, the weeds and the wildflowers, the small birds on their nests in the hedgerows, the routines of nature and those who live by the land, all within the 3-mile radius of his Northamptonshire locale, where he wandered and daydreamed and lost himself in reverie. I can't help but think that John Clare and Dorothy Wordsworth would have had a great deal to talk about if only each of them had had the chance to meet. I want to turn now to the poems that I wrote as part of the project Dorothy's Colour with Zoe Bembo in 2017, which were published in my 2018 collection, A Perfect Mirror, and to recent work by poets Sarah Doyle and Polly Atkin. Sarah Doyle and I both draw on Dorothy's Grasmere journals and Polly Atkin on Dorothy's later unpublished journals to make new poems of assemblage and reassemblage with extracts and phrases found, cribbed, excavated, hoarded or stolen from the original. It's no accident that we are women poets, perhaps no less obvious to state that as women poets, we are responding to a female voice and presence in the male-dominated world of romantic poetry. certainly as we would have certainly, I studied it when I was younger. As the title of Rhys Jones's 2014 exhibition suggests, finding Dorothy's voice is the place, as women writers, that we might begin to look to find voices of our own. All three of our collections take phrases from Dorothy's journals as titles: A Perfect Mirror, Much with Body, and Sarah Doyle's something so wild and free in this feeling. All three of our collections take phrases from Dorothy's journals title. Sorry, I lost my place. And this is also the title of Polly and I's central sequences. In contemporary parlance, we are centering Dorothy, giving her authority of influence in our work. I think we can safely say that for each of us, working with Dorothy's writings was and is an act of revoicing, of giving Dorothy's voice agency and space within our own work. Even though we each take a slightly different approach, Doyle excavates and reassembles, Atkin extracts, arranges and shapes, and I weave Dorothy's phrases in and out of my own words. We each make generous use of the spatial aspects of the page, of white space, fragments, and shape poems, opening our space for this other voice to be heard. The connections all three of us make with Dorothy's writing as poets and as women go beyond the page to the body. Myself, Doyle and Atkin are responding not only to Dorothy's vision and artistry, but to the way she places her own body at the centre of her daily life. Sarah Doyle's poem, A Heart Unequally Divided, from her 2021 V-Press pamphlet, Something So Wild and Free in This Feeling, collates phrases from throughout the journals about the heart to give us a poem picture of Dorothy as we first meet her in the Grasmere journal, sitting by the lakeside, lamenting William's absence. And thank you for Sarah Doyle for permission to read her poem here, A Heart Unequally Divided. My heart was so full that I could hardly speak. Every question was like the snapping of a little thread about my heart. I sat a long time upon a stone at the margin of the lake, and after a flood of tears, my heart was easier. The lake looked to me, I knew not why, dull and melancholy, and the weltering of the shore seemed a heavy sound. My heart dissolved. I could not help weeping. I was sick at heart. In my walk back, I had many of my saddest thoughts, and I could not keep the tears within me. My heart was almost melted away. My heart smote me, prevented me from sleeping. I was melancholy and could not talk, but at least I eased my heart with weeping. As Doyle's poem shows us, Dorothy gives us her heart, even when she is suffering. It is both abstract and absolute, a powerful living organ smiting her and preventing her from sleeping. You can hear in Doyle's arrangement the cadences in Dorothy's writing that, like poetry, keep communion with the spoken voice, yet heighten it. In reading Doyle's work alongside my own, I notice how we have chosen the same phrases to place in our poems. For example, my heart dissolved is a phrase I also use because it is a condensed expression of universal feeling, sadness, that evokes a connection with poetic vision. Dorothy often describes states of dissolving and reverie, usually after long periods of gazing at the landscape or daydreaming in the ditch in John's grove, watching the sky. John was their brother, a very beloved brother who died at sea, which she and William could do for hours. Similarly, we all respond to the journal's repeated evocations of the weather, and Polly Atkin's poem, Dorothy's Rain, written as part of the Dorothy's Colour project, is a virtuosic rendering of all the references to rain in the later journals. Atkin's sequence, Much with Body, highlights how for Dorothy the weather was never merely an external phenomena, but was often internal. The same can be said for John Clare, his mental health was very affected by the weather. An internal weather, the weather of the body, which as she ages becomes increasingly tempestuous. Again, I'm going to read some extracts from, going backwards there, from Polly's sequence of poems, Much with Body, published in her new collection, Much with Body, from Saraband Books. The night very stormy, very ill. Why or wherefore I know not. Pain, sickness, headache, perspiration, heat and cold. Exhausted and free from pain, I slept, and a hail shower falls from dazzling silver and dark clouds to remind us not to expect a calm. This evening, very stormy, rain by pailfuls driven against my windows. Blustering better, no fits, doing well and unexpectedly raining by fits. Trials smoothly over and of no importance, and showers and almost unable to speak. Letters smoke below stairs. Rain continues. Green things burst marvellously into light. Thunder calls, but I cannot see her. Strength much beaten. This should have been May Day. Trees bursting, but I am imprisoned. Sickness, much rain. I am lazy and have no pleasure. Tolerably free from pain attacks. I am no company. Showers sting me. I mend slowly. Pining, earth, transplanted, restored. I have had much pain. Dark winds blowing, showers gathering. Heavy rain, so ill so as not to be able to dress. My limbs like marble, again in much pain. Rain, rain, and gently, but rain. I want to say, I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of writing about pain in Dorothy's work, but there's also a lot of humor. And if you read Polly's poems and Sarah's poems, in the way that they reconstruct Dorothy's words, there's a lot of humor that comes through as well. So I don't want us to just think of Dorothy as this suffering person. I mean, I think there's as much wide human complexity in there and in the poems in our responses too. Throughout her sequence, Atkin makes use of Dorothy's punctuation, her repeated dashes and ampersands, sentences broken off and recollated, the disjuncture of unexpected line breaks and rhythms to express on the page so much of her bodily suffering. These poems of Atkin's call to mind the fragmented and condensed poems of Emily Dickinson, with their hectic, frantic dashes and spaces and ellipses, mimicking the breathless, often pained expressions of the embodied voice. With Zoe's frame of reference as a visual artist that suggested we draw on Dorothy's observation and recording of colour in her journals as a central motif for our project, and Dorothy's colour came into being. We spent several weeks in residence in Grasmere in the spring of 2017, walked a great deal in the places Dorothy walked, her daily route to Ambleside to collect the mail along the coffin path or via Loughrig and White Moss, one wild, dreamlike day over Silver Howe to Langdales, often reading the journal out loud as we walked. Zoe made preparatory sketches and I made notes for my poem, which I eventually wrote very quickly. It's a long sequence. Of course, you can write a poem in 10 minutes if you need to. I think it was the compression of time and the novelty of taking extracts from the journals to shape my own poetic responses that allowed me the freedom to break with formal constraints and work in a fragmented form. In the sequence of poems that follow, the lines in italics are Dorothy's and the rest are my original words. In some ways, Dorothy is an echo, like the cuckoo that bounces hill from hill, the poet speaker is listening for. In places, in a dream, half seen in a lane at night, on the hillside at Loughrig, time collapses and the figure of Dorothy breaks through the veil. I'm not going to read the whole of the poem. I'm just going to read a few of the extracts. And then I'll finish. A perfect mirror. Grasmere. First night here, spring snow flurries. I sat a long time. Hail, then rain, the lake slate black, blown in cups and wavelets. Walked among the stones of the shore. The line of the mountains merging with the last branch of light from the north, water light, scarlet lit, peachy gold, till my heart was easier, and later, over Silver How, a clouded moon. Next morning, on the path to Rydal, a heron fishing, a red squirrel. On the path, a blind man, a woman begging, a little girl. Now as then the lake, an image of stillness, clear as glass. In the hills, dips and crevices, snow like lost silver. Pebbles on the road glittered like silver, frostings among the stones of the wall. I dream Coleridge's dream, black-haired woman, wild-faced, waking me into a moon-flooded room. A very fine moonlight night, the moon shone. Is it you, Dorothy? Dream a boat tethered at the water's edge, wash away dirt to the undergleam, like herrings in the water, a fish's silver scales. At sunset, red lights behind Langdales, these hard times, a terrible kind of threatening brightness. Loughrig. I sit against the moss-legged hawthorn and watch the veil unfold a painted cloth. I lay upon the steep, sun on the lake, a blanket of crushed diamonds, the water spotted with sparkles, cloud shadows moving across the hills, lilac scree, thumbed in bruises, until my heart dissolved. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Don't know how I get out of that.
Thanks so much. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you short, Sarah. Just otherwise, I'm worried we won't have any time for questions, which would be.
I was also worried about that. It's fine. It's fine. Don't worry. It was all the technology at the beginning.
Great. Thank you so much.
How do I get rid of this? Somebody get rid of that for me.
If you click on the little arrow, it should unshare your screen. You see a little box with an arrow in it.
Yeah, yeah.
Next
That
to
should
the
unshare it, and then you're okay. There you go.
Okay.
So we'll move straight on to Polly, if that's okay.
Pavilion. So there we go. You should be able to see my screen now. Excellent. Thank you, Sarah, so much. And thanks, Sally, and thanks everyone for tuning in as well. And I'm sorry about the tech issues. It's the mysteries of Teams to me. And it was really wonderful, Sarah, especially to hear my poems in your voice there as well was a real treat, actually. So I want to start by saying a little bit about how my book, Recovering Dorothy, came into being before reading a little bit from it. So as Sally said, it began really with my doctorate at the Department for English and Creative Writing at Lancaster and in sociology as well, which just shifted the entire centres of my life and thinking. So I moved to Grasmere to do field research at the Wordsworth Trust. And my focus wasn't just on literature, but on Grasmere itself, on how a place becomes a particular place and what William Wordsworth and his poetry had to do with creating, intentionally or unintentionally, the Grasmere I came to live in. And before I came to Grasmere, I really didn't know much about Dorothy Wordsworth at all. I didn't do Romanticism as an undergrad, I know, shocker. And I don't think I'd ever really read her before then. I knew she was the sister of the more famous poet. I knew she kept a journal, and I knew her journals were important to her brother's poems, but that's pretty much it. And I had no idea that there were other journals, which I would find out about much later. So I would move away, move back again, graduate, and fail to move away again before I'd first hear about Dorothy's other journals, written from 1824 to 1835, but never published. In December 1824, not long before her 53rd birthday, Dorothy began again to keep a journal of daily life at home. This she continues, though with pauses, until 1835. These later journals are sometimes called the Rydal journals because they were written during the year she lived at Rydal Mount, in the hamlet of Rydal, just a few miles south of Grasmere. These journals, fragmentary, partial, represent, along with a few letters and poems, the primary record of the years of Dorothy's illness from 1829 to 1835 in her own words. But there's not been a complete transcript of the journals, let alone a reading text available to the public, although one is coming soon, which is really exciting. So as Sarah said, in 2017, she asked me to contribute to the exhibition that she did with Zoe Bembo, Dorothy's Colour. And I realised that I could do in poetry what I'd wanted to do in academia and couldn't, to bring those Rydal journals to the public, to new readers, by making them into poems, taking her words and rearranging them in all those fascinating ways that Sarah just talked about so absolutely wonderfully. And they become the central sequence of my second poetry collection, which is here. So that's a little bit of the Rydal journals there, and you can see that they are quite difficult to deal with. So there we go. There's Much with Body and Recovering Dorothy. So in June 2020, my partner, who works in a bookshop, had a conversation with Sarah Hunt, who is my editor at Saraband, about why there were no new books coming out to mark Dorothy's 250th. And with a nudge or two, Recovering Dorothy was born, and it came directly out of this working with the journals to make the poems. In the introduction, I explain a bit more about why I wanted to write this book. So I'm going to read you a passage now from that part of the introduction. Dorothy's biographers have a peculiar predilection for killing her long before her death. Ernest de Selincourt, in his 1933 biography, separates off the last 20 years of her life from 1835 to 1855 as posthumous life, life after death. He explains, the 20 years of posthumous life that followed only belong to the biography of Dorothy Wordsworth insofar as they reveal in fitful gleams something of what she once had been. No one, he implies, should want or need to know about what he calls her days of insensibility or mental vagary. In a weighty biography that is otherwise thoughtful and thorough in its presentation of the records of her life, this elision is particularly striking. These 20 years of posthumous life are a tragedy it is better not to speak of, or, if one absolutely must, give it 8 pages at most. Helen Derbyshire follows this line in her 1958 edition of Dorothy's journals, pointing to a prolonged period of life and death before Dorothy's actual death. In using the phrase life and death, she summons the ghastly spectre from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, with her red lips, free looks, gold hair, and skin as white as leprosy, who thicks man's blood with cold. This presents Dorothy as like the mariner, cursed, trapped in an in-between state, neither really living nor free to die, which of course reflects how a lot of people think about disability, and begins to explain the desire of biographers and scholars to choose a different ending for Dorothy, one they think is more fitting. Frances Wilson, in her 2008 biography, The Ballad of Dorothy Wordsworth, takes it furthest, calling William's marriage to Mary in October 1803 Dorothy's funeral. She places what she calls the peak of Dorothy's life as a time between Christmas 1799 and October 1802, and describes her as fossilized for us in her Grasmere journals, as though nothing happened to her either before or since. That's her words. For a woman who lived to be 84, that seems to be a deliberate denial of much of her life. For Wilson, Dorothy becomes a kind of nightmare crone, literally the mad woman in the attic, with her long-lost reason haunting the top of their house like the discarded first wife in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Which seems very convenient for Wilson as well, because she wants to focus on a different kind of Dorothy. Carl Ketchum in 1978 is slightly more ambiguous, placing Dorothy not in death, but in mental darkness. And this idea of those years as years of darkness really takes off and starts to define how people think about these last bits of Dorothy's life. And that really troubled me. So this book arises from two entangled impulses, which might be more or less righteous or plausible than each other. Firstly, to shine a light into that darkness and restore the rest of Dorothy's narrative. William's marriage to Mary in 1803 was definitely not Dorothy's funeral, literally or figuratively. She lived another 52 years afterwards. What are we doing when we write off those years? They are years we hear little about. So my book hopes, if nothing else, to remind readers that Dorothy was still Dorothy all that time. She didn't die, emotionally or otherwise, until 1855, actually 2 days ago in 1855. Yesterday in 1855, the 25th of January. She didn't vanish. She wasn't undone. She may have changed, as we all do, in sickness and health, but she was still Dorothy. The second reason is a bit more dubious, which is a desire to understand her illness. We always, of course, read through the prism of our own biases. This is my bias. At 34, I was diagnosed with a hereditary connective tissue disorder, and then a year later, a hereditary iron loading disorder, after decades of seeking diagnosis and being rebuffed. The myriad ways I've been told that my symptoms were imaginary, stress-related, psychogenic, emotional, stemming from my own oversensitivity, could fill many books. So when I see readers, scholars, and biographers look at the lives of dead women and dead writers in general, especially writers they claim to admire, and disavow their testimony of their own bodies, I see what I've experienced myself. I can't be certain, of course, that I am right and they are wrong. This is why I say it's slightly dubious, but I believe it is both ethically and medically dubious anyway to diagnose dead people from the partial record left from their writings and descriptions of them in other people's writings. Biographies of writers' lives are full of posthumous diagnoses of conditions we cannot be certain of. I know this, but I also know that compulsion to know what is wrong is strong. I know that we can't know. All that we have, in the words of Dorothy from her poem, Thoughts on My Sickbed, are known and unknown things. So I hope my book will open a conversation about retrospective diagnosis, about ableism in academia, about women in illness, about disability representation, and about disabled lives. When I hear scholars describe Dorothy's later years as non-time, as darkness or nothingness, I can't help wondering how they describe portions of my own life too. So this book is really underpinned by the assertion that the lives of disabled people are as rich and as worthwhile as the lives of non-disabled people. Even if you don't see us or hear us, we're still here. And I think that really comes through as well in what Sarah was saying about there still being that sense of humour and particularly that sense of beauty in Dorothy's later writing as in her earlier writing. So she has a series of acute episodes of illness from 1829 to 1835. The last one in 1835 leaves her with a cognitive impairment. This cognitive damage alters her relationship with writing, as well as her place in the household. Reading and writing has become increasingly difficult for her during her illness. She feels more comfortable with the idea of herself as a writer, though. And I just want to read a tiny bit about this from chapter 2. Just going to check our time there as well. Okay. So, chapter 2. In spring 1838, Dorothy writes a short letter to her niece Dora. Dorothy calls for Dora to send her news, not current affairs, but gossip and information about the outside world. My own thoughts, she writes, are a wilderness. What does Dorothy mean by this? That her thoughts are wild, unapproachable, untamable, unknowable? It's compelling to read it in this way. It might sound as though Dorothy is saying she is not knowable to herself. She elaborates on her wilderness of thoughts with a quote from Edmund Spenser's epic poem, The Faerie Queene, not pierceable by power of any star. The line from Book 1, Canto 1 of the epic poem describes a literal wilderness in which the couple finds shelter from a hideous storm of rain. What might seem a negative description, a wilderness of thought so overgrown that no star's light can pierce their depths, becomes more ambiguous when placed beside the poem and beside this place in Dorothy's life. The grove in the Faerie Queene is a fair harbour in a terrible storm, with lofty trees clad in summer greenery, under which paths and alleys lead inward to further shelter. Her thoughts, Dorothy seems to be saying, may be fair shelter from hideous weather, of the body or of the land. Like the paths in the Fairy Queen, however, they may be misleading, beguiling, taking the traveller so far into the harbour that they cannot find their way out and begin to doubt their own minds. Dorothy gets one word wrong in this quote. The poem reads, not pierceable with power of any star. And this error has been used to build evidence of the failure of her memory. I can't remember that much, so I think she's done quite well. The letter itself is as rich as the poem, as layered in meanings. Her thoughts are a forest so deep and rich with life, she might get lost in them and not return. So she asks for news from elsewhere instead, news of the outside world, of others' lives. She then shares some news from her home, deaths of friends and neighbours. She admits she's anticipated her own death, but still holds on to life. I've fought and fretted and striven, and I'm here beside the fire. Others have survived winter alongside her. The doves behind me at the small winter, the laburnum with its naked seed pods, shivers before my window, and the pine tree rock from their base. The storm, it seems, still rages. One of the things I find so fascinating about this period of her life is that Dorothy finally seems to come to terms with the idea of wanting a literary legacy and of wanting to be remembered. And I think this is something that, again, people don't realise when they don't really look at this. In a poem written for Dora's album in 1832, she asks, why should I inscribe my name, not poet I, no longer young? She answers herself with the old accusations of pushing herself forward, of speaking when she should not. The ambition of a loving heart makes garrulous the tongue. But it's a long poem, and she writes it as a poem. And she likes the idea that these verses will remain for her long after Dorothy has gone. Dora, she writes, won't need verses to remind of her aunt, and she herself in the grave will not need praise. But the poem ends with an acknowledgement that she does, after all, want a hint of literary immortality. Yet still a lurking wish prevails that when from life we all have passed, the friends who love thy parents' name on hers a thought may cast. And before writing this poem, Dorothy's had to face the very imminent possibility of her death time after time, and it seems to have changed her thoughts about legacy. And also her time in the sick room has kind of broken her role in the machine of domestic creativity that has been, until this point, the mainstay of the collaborative creative lives of all of the family. William's struggling to write poetry when Dorothy actually has this freedom to suddenly write and pay attention to her own work. The irony is that the sick room both frees and limits. It liberates its occupant from domestic duties, but the physical conditions make domestic work impossible and also limit creative work. In March 1835, she writes in her journal, the greatest evil attending my present disordered state is that I can read or work little or none. But she does write, and she keeps writing poetry. And I find this really fascinating and an aspect of her life that is really, really underexplored. And she keeps sending poems to friends as well. So she's got rid of her earlier fear that she's not good enough. And I just think that's absolutely fascinating. So I'm just going to finish by looking briefly at this letter, which she writes in September 1837. So after her supposed 20 years of darkness has appeared. And during this time, she copies out loads of poems and sends them to friends. And this is just one example sent to Hannah Hoare, which are some of, as she says, many verses which have slipped from me, I know not how, which I think is fascinating. She struggled to find a clear path through the many thoughts crowding her mind, like the trees in the fir grove, a chaotic wilderness. But poetry finds a way through more easily somehow. It paces the path out. In her illness and the limitations it imposes on her, she finds both comfort and pleasure in her own words. She repeats her verses in company, sends them to friends. She's no longer embarrassed of herself or her skills or of wanting recognition. She's no longer so concerned with perfection, but sees that she can find solace in what is uneven, messy, and incomplete. She's at last confident to be the poet she is and not the poet she couldn't be. Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for such a great pair of papers, sort of raising so many issues for us. We've got just about 10 minutes left, so if people do have questions, either I guess write them in the chat if you're shy, or if you're bold. You can put the sort of hand symbol, and hopefully we'll see you've got your hand up and invite a question from you. I mean, I guess I'll start things off whilst other people have a chance to think about it. I'll get my 2 for 1, so I'll get 2 questions out of one here. So, I mean, obviously, I think you're sort of partly answering my question for me, Polly, but I guess the dominant problem in a way with the Grasmere journals is the motivation is so obviously that they are written for William, or from a feminist perspective that may or may not be a problem, but they are very much written for William, and Sarah was saying written to be read aloud, which I think is really interesting actually to think of them like that. So I guess one question is, what then is the motivation? How has that motivation changed? And I think you are kind of maybe sort of suggesting that in a way that what is the motivation later then, if it's not written for William? Why does she want to keep writing? And a link question, I guess, going back to Sarah, thinking about comparing Dorothy and John Clare, who I'm doing together I haven't actually ever taught them together. I'm doing it next week on the MA. I'm putting them together, but anyway, and I was thinking, well, obviously John Clare also sort of loses his identity through illness in later life and sort of becomes someone else. And I was wondering if there was anything, to think about there.
That's really interesting, isn't it? So shall I start talking about the journals? I think they are written for William and they are written to share, and I think that's really important. And I think people forget that when they are accusing William of stealing Dorothy's words all the time. But that's the secondary reason that she puts in the journal herself, isn't it? She says, I'm writing this so I will not quarrel with myself. And I think that's really important. And I think that's kind of what comes through later on, and why I think she keeps kind of beginning and then stopping. But I think mostly I think she does want a record of her own life as she goes through. And of course, that becomes increasingly important during these years of really confusing illness as well, trying to kind of keep track of things. One of the things that has come out with the edition that is going to come out of the Rydal journals is that she marks down when she begins a new bottle of medicine, of laudanum in there, because she wants to keep track of it, because she doesn't want to become an addict. She wants to know what she's taking when. And I think that's really fascinating. But also that I think that sense of just trying to understand yourself. Yeah. Do you think so as well, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who does a lot of journaling, I mean, I think that certainly the Grasmere journals, and you can hear that in the journals themselves, and in the work that Sarah Doyle and I have done with our own poetry, is that it's writing, as in capital W, writing. It's very beautifully phrased in places, a real sense of cadence, there's variation in sentence length, and there's detail, there's all these kind of things going on, they're little mini kind of stories. And I do, it makes you think whether she was consciously thinking that, or came to consciously think, even privately, this is my writing. I mean, I don't know what you find the differences in the Rydal journals, but as we know as writers, once you've learned that when you're younger, then it's there. So when she's writing, perhaps later in life, that facility with expression and shape and sound and language, it's there. So yeah, I guess that's what I wonder, whether she secretly actually thought, this is my writing.
I wonder, I mean, I was just thinking back to you saying, Polly, that she couldn't really read anymore as well, because she reads a lot, and she reads aloud a lot, and she reads to William a lot. So I wonder if there's almost a sense in when that, if she can no longer, because she can't read, she writes, whether those two things are also interconnected.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I think more almost with the poems than with the journals, because the obviously the patches of most serious illness, aside from the fact that Gordon Graham Wordsworth just chopped the worst bits out because he didn't think that any of us should be able to see them, which is a different story. There are also long periods where she doesn't write herself either, where she just can't write, and there's gaps when she's too ill. But then there is this kind of slightly in between phase where she can begin to express in poetry what she can't even express in her journal, and which she can't read.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, I think once I'd started to think about John Clare and Dorothy Wordsworth, you wouldn't have been able to shut me up.
Yeah.
Oh my God,
Yeah.
there's so much here. You know, I mean, you'll know better than me, Sally, but Clare must have read Wordsworth's poems. I mean, he must have read the Prelude. I'm pretty sure he did, didn't he? And you know, he must have done. Whether the Wordsworths were aware of John Clare, I don't know. Obviously, by the time he was, you know, publishing, so his first book comes out in 1820. You know, you could imagine a scenario where they might have met. I was trying to think about this morning. Could they have met? But there's so many parallels, I think, to draw between them. Clare, particularly as you know, he's seen as a peasant poet. We might think of him as a sort of working class writer, who is kind of, you know, sort of ridiculed and silenced. And Dorothy, as I mean, being a woman doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to. There are plenty of women writing at that time, but perhaps it's to do with the relationship that she's in relation to William, but in some sense being silenced. And then, you know, Clare obviously ends up in an asylum in later life. He keeps writing. And Dorothy, you know, is again. Both of them suffer this kind of eclipse, don't they? As well. And there's also a problem with. There's so many parallels. I'm sure there's like a book on this. I mean, there's a problem with access to Clare's work for academics in the 20th century, which has really held back, you know, the development of the critical work on Clare, you know, and similar occlusions with Dorothy as well. So. And then just the way in which they both write about nature.
Yeah.
It's very different to how the big male romantic poets are writing about nature, you know, and it's much closer to how eco poets, I don't hate that phrase. Poets are always writing about nature. What's the difference? But, you know, contemporary poets who are writing about nature, it's a much similar entry point. It's much more at that close level, the ground level. Kind of honouring nature itself, but just through the detail, through the phenomena. So yeah, I think there's a big research project and a book.
Yeah, definitely. I think John maybe had a question that he was tentatively thinking about posing. John.
Yeah, I was intrigued by Dorothy's letter where she says, "Give me some news because it's a resting place." So she's almost saying, "Give me history." And then she's putting it under erasure as just a kind of Sabbath, where the men might take history seriously, but for her, it's given me, and then under erasure, it's a resting place. So really, it's just a question for both of you about the role of history as we tend to think of it, insofar as it comes in or out of Dorothy's writing.
Gosh, that's really fascinating as well, because obviously the thing she's spending most time with at that time in terms of her in reading and writing is a commonplace book where she's also writing down, you know, things from other people's writing that she finds really fascinating, kind of copying out bits from history. And history is really interesting to her. And when she is reading, often she's reading the lives of other people, and she is reading history as well as contemporary theology and politics and all sorts of more than what we think of as creative writing in that sense. But I think that really reveals like what is the news, I think is the question there. And the news is stuff about people, and that's what she's missing because she's really isolated. And it becomes a different way for her to connect, I think. What do you think, Sarah?
I mean, obviously, you're perhaps thinking about the Rydal years, and if we think back to the sort of early years in Grasmere, I mean, we do have to understand Dorothy and William as being incredibly kind of up to date with what's going on. I mean, obviously William, witnessed kind of aspects of the French Revolution, and Dorothy, we know, they're kind of reading to each other and they're working together on the poems. I think they would have been incredibly aware of what was going on. And all that stuff about the kind of the vagrants isn't the right word, but people who are passing the cottage, who because of the wars that are going on, who've become beggars, who've lost everything. So I think they were incredibly connected to what was happening, both within sort of Britain at the time and within the world. They were political people, I think. Whether that answers the question about history and what we think is history.
Anyone else with a question they'd like to pose? You can write if you want to speak. Yeah, I nearly did my PhD on the commonplace book. Very nearly. Very interesting.
It's so fascinating, and just such an amazing space. It's such a palimpsest of different things as well. It is absolutely brilliant. Michelle Levy is doing all this amazing kind of textual forensics work on it, which is really fascinating, and I can't wait to hear more of what she's been doing with it.
I mean, that was the other thing that struck me. Since no one else asking a question, I'll just hold forth endlessly. In a lot of the artistic work that you were showing, Sarah, but also other, exhibitions I've seen at the Trust, like people with, doing those physical poems, which I really like, out of another text. I mean, there is a lot. Dorothy seems to attract a certain way of responding to her, almost in that kind of mosaic, like these phrases that are then respoken. I haven't particularly seen that in relation to another writer. So what is it about her writing that encourages that kind of response? That sort of weaving, you talked about, like weaving her voice in almost.
I think that perhaps one of the reasons is that from the perspective of a poet, is that you're not taking the words of other poems. So there's that, so there's freedom in that, but also that at the same time, the text is full of poetry. But it's full of the kind of poetry perhaps that a contemporary poet might recognize. I guess that's
so
what it is.
It's latent poetry, so you all take advantage.
And it's kind of up for grabs, I suppose, because if it's. I mean, I know that poets, and I do myself, also kind of use intertextuality with other poets' work from the past. I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting question. Why does she provoke such a kind of passionate? We're all very passionate about her. And I know, Polly, in Recovering Dorothy, you do make a reference to Sylvia Plath as well, and Plath would be another writer that we might think about as well in lots of ways, lots of similar ways alongside Dorothy, and also someone who provokes incredible kind of passion. But yeah, those of us who are kind of in this little Dorothy rewriting cult, we get very, very passionate about her but also I think that she's kind of a character, a figure who, all the description we have from her, from Coleridge and De Quincey, of this kind of extraordinary individual, actually. And as an artist and as a woman artist who, for whatever reasons, wasn't able to. I mean, she didn't seem to want to at the time, but didn't she? I guess that's a question that Polly explores in more depth. And this feeling of reclaiming, giving her voice, feels important. And also perhaps we see aspects of ourselves in her, or want to.
Yeah, I think it's all of that, and also the fact that because her writing is so fragmentary as well, I think it lets you in a complete writing doesn't, in a different kind of way. So there are these gaps, there are these ellipses. Literally, you can kind of crawl into the text, but when you crawl into the text, what you find is these images that are just so powerful and so right and so extraordinarily fresh down the centuries.
Mm.
I think people just it kind of magpie towards them, don't they?
Yeah.
They're shiny and you can't help it.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll end there with the image of the poet as magpie. Thank you very much. I'm sure we're all clapping in our individual spaces. Thank you so much for such a nice creative event today, and thank you for everyone for coming.